Hello everybody, and welcome back to the tier list series. We are back today with part 2. Initially, this was going to be purely E-tier players. The reality of the situation is that the E-tier is the smallest in the entire list, so instead I'm going to be going through a portion of the D tier as well. The D tier is very big, and the E tier is a little bit small in comparison, and I don't feel comfortable dropping some of the D tier players down to E, so we'll just get into a bit of the D tier today as a little bit of a taster. But in general, I want to make this clear, as always, these players involved in this tier list are, roughly 200 people overall. It's going to end up being more than that. And if you are an E-tier player in this tier list, that doesn't mean you're an E-tier player in relation to the entire game. This is just an E-tier player in relation to this list. You'll be very surprised at some of the names who are D-tier and low C tier because there's so many good players. So I want to make this clear that the E tier people are people I consider to be 3 to 5 out of 10 players. So at the bottom of the E tier, I'd consider them 3 out of 10 players. At the top of it, I'd consider them 5 out of 10 players. If you're top of the E tier, that means you're average. And that's good in Resistance, because so many solo queuers obviously don't know how to play the game, and that's normal. But if I mention you as an E-tier player at the top of the E-tier, that means if I saw you in solo queue on my team, I'd think that's fine. I'd be like, cool, that's better than a good amount, a good percentage of people that I could have had on my team. Because again, there's so many solo queuers, so many people who just play casually. This whole tier list is just people who have played for a period of time, who are notable enough or have been mainstays, and I've seen around. So, in this case, do not believe that, especially the D tier, do not believe that the D tier is bad. I consider those players to be like 5.5 out of 10 to 6 to 6.5 out of 10. Like, there's some good players in the D tier, but in relation to how many amazing players there is overall, some people just had to go in the D tier comparatively. But anyway, now that's out of the way, let's get started with the E tier today. First up, at the bottom of the E tier, we have Big Daddy Virgil. Now, Big Daddy Virgil, I mean, I've had a good connection with him most of the time, but for the most part, he does often play builds that are just very, very big time givers, and he's played a lot, and he didn't really get any better. There's not much more to say, to be honest, about Big Daddy Virgil. He's just your run-of-the-mill mastermind that you'll come across every few days when you play the game. He's there as a staple. He clearly enjoys the game. Fair play to him for that. He's not particularly good, and that's fine. Up next is Vampire. Now, again, I'll gladly give people their praise where it's due, but with Vampire, this is one of the guys who would never ever have a nice word to say about anybody. I think as a player, as a mastermind, he isn't the worst. I think he is definitely E-tier material. Like, I've seen him give away plus 20s to Tyrones or whatever with his Nikolai. Like, he isn't that good at all. His Annette is definitely his strongest, and that is okay. Definitely can get wins against duos, but yeah, Vampire would always rage quit. We know this. It's very rare to finish a game with him. And obviously, I'm not going to factor in if people boast about all their wins on YouTube and are just horrible to people. I'm not going to factor that into how good they are as a player on this tier list. But Vampire, the fact he'd always rage quit and then boast as well about winning, it's just... I don't know how he didn't get bored of it. Very strange, but anyway. Up next on the E tier, we have one of the biggest streamers from back in the day, Tide Time. We know about him, we know about Swing Point. Tide Time made quite a few Resistance YouTube videos. He played the game for a good period of time. I believe he stopped playing it just before the final update, and he checked out the final update, gave his thoughts on it, and left it there. He was an interesting player. I enjoyed watching his builds. They were entertaining to watch. They were fun to watch. But was he particularly good? No. And what made it a bit more sour was him having these flawed builds, and then whenever he could win 10 matches out of 11, but when he lost to a half-decent team, he would throw massive tantrums. And again, I'm not factoring that into how good he is as a player, but, you know, maybe if he was a little bit more accepting or didn't give up against the SWAT teams immediately, he could have been okay, because he had the right basic ideas. He used decent equipment, he used decent decks, and it was still in one of the early stages of the game. I understand why he got annoyed and left because of SWATs, because they are annoying, but at the end of the day, it did still feel hypocritical also. But yeah, as a player, he was okay. And that's about it. He was better than the Resistance player base at that time, because again, there were so many people who played the game who aren't going to be on this list. But in comparison to everybody in this tier list, he's just, you know, E tier. Next up, we have an Annette main in Fade Mandlawi. Honestly, not too much to say here. I like his name. It's quite interesting. He's not particularly good. He was pretty high rank. Pretty laggy. But I've never seen him say a negative word about people. I've never seen him get salty or annoyed. He's just one of those staple Annettes that I see around or saw around, and yeah, he takes up a spot in the E tier. Next up is Magic Magma. Now, this is probably a player that most of you won't know. She is one of the people that I played with quite, not often, but I'd say consistently. I'd team up with her at least a couple times a week. Very nice girl to be around, very kind, very polite and humble. And we often had really fun customs and games with her. As a player, she wasn't particularly amazing, but she was very nice to be around. Have no bad words to say about her as a person, nowhere near. But yeah, she mained Valerie. She was okay. She mained Jan. Her Jan wasn't that good. And it just balances out to, you know, a player who, if you saw them in solo queue, you'd be like, ooh, they might do something wrong in this match that throws it away, and they're not going to win it for us either. So, yeah. Next up is a Tyrone main, Pat Chiller. I'll be honest, when I first played with Pat, I was really thinking he'd be super good, because he was a high rank, if I remember right. End of the day, what happened in reality is he would die a lot. He would struggle with Daniels a hell of a lot for a Tyrone. He'd just die a lot. He had his moments. He was fine with his fever skill. He could pull out a decent kick here and there, but he was a Tyrone main and he struggled with creature to melee combat. So it's not particularly a ringing endorsement. So yeah. Next up we have Cute Q Cube. Very high ranked Jill main. I used to see them around a hell of a lot more back in the day. They do still play now. They've never been particularly good. They're just your very okay solo queue player. Now, there were a couple of things mentioned about QQ Cube, about them being a duper. I honestly can't remember if they did or not, so I'm not going to run to the hills with that, but yeah, there was definitely a little suspicion or two of things that were dodgy about them, and then they did rage quit as well. Yeah, they, again, as I say, were a perfectly serviceable random in solo queue. Like, you wouldn't be devastated to have them on your team. It's not like having a rank 1, but overall, compared to everyone else, it's just, you know, mid. Anyway, next up we have Symphonic Phantom. Now, this is probably the most well-known player so far. He played a couple of years back now, actually. He hasn't played for a long time. He was a January main, very high rank with her, played a very unorthodox build with her. He used camera lockdown on his personal skill and on the fever as well. And with Symphonic Phantom, he had a few main flaws. He wasn't particularly good with his aim. He wasn't very receptive to improvements for him to be made. Like, he had been told that there's no point in having camera rotation jam as your fever skill because it doesn't work. The mastermind can bypass it. And he just flat out denied it and said, no, it doesn't. It's the best way to counter terminal Spencers and it works. So stuff like that was part of the reason why he had a ceiling, because he wasn't particularly good and he didn't want to hear anything to make him better either. And yeah, I mean, I can't say I ever got on with him personally either, but the main issues were him being a super high ranked Jan that thought he was much better than a lot of other Jans, so he'd take Jan off of better Jans than him, and he wouldn't be able to back it up in matches, so all evens out to an E tier. Next up is Scorpion Rules MK. Maybe a tad harsh, this one, I accept that, but at the end of the day, this guy has never had a good connection with anybody. His builds are, he plays some meta builds, but even with 5 to 10 seconds of delay, this guy will not only voice line spam, but he'll also end up losing matches. And I do believe that if people had even decent connections with him, that he'd lose a vast majority of his games. Like, one of the recent times I faced him was his Cam Health Nikolai. Everybody on my team had at least 3 seconds of delay, and he ran maximum Cam Health, and yet he was still giving away so many 20s. So yeah, very, very lazy player who deliberately picks licker presets, who knows that he lags, still continues to do it, and isn't that good either. So E tier. Similar type of questionable mastermind is Kim Jong-peng. He plays a few masterminds. I think he's best known for the ambusher net he plays. He'll always leave at the last core, before the last core. He's not very talented with it. And I've seen him lose to solo queue people constantly. Yeah, just a very average player who, for some reason, rage quits all the time, even though he loses in the most vanilla, fair matches ever. So it's a puzzle. Next up is Chef Rob Medina. Now, by all accounts, this guy seems like a nice guy. I've seen him on Facebook groups. He seems nice and personable. He isn't a good mastermind. He isn't a good Alex, Daniel, Spencer. As a survivor, he is okay. I'd push him maybe in the bottom of D tier for his survivor skills, but his mastermind is that bad that it kind of drags him down. But as a person, I've barely talked to him myself, but he's always seemed more than fine. And yeah, credit to him for playing both sides, survivor and mastermind. So I'm not going to be too harsh on him. It's why he's at the top of the E tier, but yeah, again, somebody has to be there, and he is one of those people. Next up is Jan Becker Snake Eyes. See, this one, to me, when I first thought about her for this list, I was like, oh yeah, that's an easy D tier. But then when I thought it over, I was like, they're not very good. Yeah, they take up pretty important characters in the team, like Jan and Val, and they don't play them very well. Yeah, it's pretty basic to outline with her. She seems to have fun with the game, she seems to enjoy it. It's just remarkably average, and that's about it. And to round off the E tier, before we skip into the start of the D tier, we have Wookie. Wookie is a very high-rated player. He maxed out his Martin. He got his Tyrone up to a good level as well. Credit to him, he always played solo queue. Like, no matter what, that guy got a 999 Martin by playing solo queue. So all respect to him for that. In terms of his ability, he obviously picked up some bad solo queue habits as well. Very questionable weapon choices, melee choices, just in general how he would position himself and play. He would rage quit at times, but more than at times. He did rage quit quite often, but if he plays solo queue all the time, I'll give him leeway for that. But yeah, just Wookie, when I say the E tier goes up to 5 out of 10 players, and I think about solo queue, and I think about who is the most 5 out of 10 player I could think of, it's probably Wookie. So he rounds off the E tier. And I'll just talk for about 5 more minutes. I don't want these videos to drag. I want them to be about 20 to 25 minutes, at least at the start. Like, there's no way some of the tiers are going to be brief, but yeah, a little sprinkling of the D tier to set us on our way. We will start with Ultimate Chain, who is a super high-ranked Becker. did they get to 999 in the end? I think they did. And they just had that problem where they would main only one character, and then all of those bad habits they'd picked up of playing that one character shone through. The thing is with Becca is she is probably the worst survivor. And the problem with Ultimate Chain was that they were very defensive with their Becca gameplay. They'd hide a lot. They'd run out of ammo by just taking long-range pot shots that did little damage. It was just very inefficient, ineffective gameplay, and yeah, the fact that they took up a spot as Becca as well obviously would make the team as a whole less functional. So yeah, the start of the D tier for Ultimate Chain. Next up is Jackety. Jackety, again, is one of these people who you'd bump into in solo queue, and you'd think, oh, that's alright, because that is the case. Again, I must emphasize, the D tier are people I consider to be above 5 out of 10 players. Like, there's a lot of people who are below 5 out of 10 in this game. They're mostly solo queuers, they're mostly casual players. If you're on this list and you're in D tier, you are at least above average. And Jackety is as well. He's perfectly okay. I've seen his Jan do okay. I've seen his Val do okay. He's more consistent than Wookie. He's more sensible in his gameplay than Wookie. And that's just Jackety. An okay, steady Eddie solo queue teammate who you're relieved to have on your team rather than a baby. And that is okay. Up next is one of my friends, Light Pep Talk. Pep, if he continued playing, he would be higher than this. He stopped properly playing a year and a half, 2 years back, and his Tyrone back in the day was okay. His Valerie was okay too. He did have his flaws, but that's because he played very casually. He just wanted to have fun with me, Mike, and the others, and he's a thoroughly nice human being. I don't have a bad word to say about Pep. He was just a perfectly okay survivor, and to be fair to him, he was an okay Anchor Spencer as well. But yeah, Pep is a lovely guy. I wanted to include him in the list because he's lovely, and I wanted to focus on who he is as a person because he's lovely. So, very happy to have played with you for a period of time, Pep, and thank you for being you. Up next, we have... I do feel a little bit bad about this one because I know he puts a lot of effort into his Tyrone and his Valerie. It's Adolfo. His knowledge of the game is fine, solid, serviceable, but he is pretty unaware when he's in a dangerous situation. Like, for example, he could be the only one at the core when Mr. X is out and spawned, and Mr. X will be closing in on him, and he'll still wail away at the core, and then he'll get downed just to do a little bit more damage to the core. And that's like a consistent trend of his. Again, I'm not saying Adolfo's bad. He is above average. He's in that 5.5 or just above rating area. And fair play to him as well. He always picks up USB duty with Tyrone. His Tyrone is a high rank, 400 plus, and he'll always play USB, even in duo queue, even in solo queue sometimes. So takes a lot of commitment. Credit to him for that. And yeah, a okay placement overall. Next up, we have Brandon Cruz. Now, Brandon, back in the day, I'm talking 2 years ago, Brandon was bad by the standards of someone who's played the game quite a lot. Brandon did improve over time. He plays the game to have fun, and that is ultimately his mentality, and that's why he'll goof around and he'll try and 1v1 the bioweapon. Like, he's not going to be the sweatiest player ever, and that is fine. But yeah, he improved from where he was. If I did this tier list a couple years back, he'd have been F, and now he's a few ways into the D tier. His Tyrone's beaten me. His Valerie is okay. His USB 8 Martin is endearing. So yeah, Brandon, the next up in the D tier. Next up is going to be Leicester's D1. This guy's interesting. So I wouldn't say he's the worst Anchor Spencer in the world. He also has another account, which is Leicester's Online. Like, two accounts that run basically the exact same build, bar like one card, and yeah, he's high rank on both of them. It's quite interesting, but Leicester's is just a very interesting character in general. I think he's like if you were stuck in a time capsule in 2020 Resistance, because his Spencer is very much one that would have done pretty well back in the day, but it didn't age very well. And yeah, his Ambushonet is also okay. He does rage quit. He does do some questionable things, but if you face him as Mastermind and you are solo or duo, he can definitely take a win. Like, he's good enough to take a win. He has enough knowledge about the game to beat a solo or duo team. But yeah, just an outdated build in general. But I understand if he finds it fun at the same time. Next up, where was I? Lost my order for a second. Okay, next up is, I mentioned Tide Time earlier. Next up is Swing Point. Swing Point's such an interesting player to judge because he did the most for the community in terms of information, in terms of, well, he was the biggest Resistance online presence. He did a great job for introducing new players to the game. His knowledge of the game was very, very, respectable. Very good. He put in the hours. Like, I learned a lot of information from Swing Point. He definitely made me realize little things about the game that, helped. So in terms of knowledge, he was very good. He put loads and loads of hours into testing all the numbers in the practice lab and all of that stuff. As a player, his skills didn't really match his dedication to finding out good builds. But again, that's just how he was. He enjoyed finding the good builds rather than being good with the good builds. So credit to him for that. Credit to him for, giving newcomers a base to go off of, what builds to potentially run when they're getting to know the game. And yeah, he definitely did his part. Just wasn't particularly skilled. He was, again, okay, but he wasn't particularly amazing. And to wrap up today, I think I'll actually leave it on swing point. That's a good one. And we've hit the half-an-hour mark, so, you know, a few into the D tier. Leave it on swing point because that's an interesting cliffhanger. And we'll go through more of the D tier next episode. Whether we finish it, I don't know, because it's quite big. But yeah, it's been an interesting one to think of people for this this video, because I feel the E tier to bottom D tier is some of the most awkward places to place people, because it's a bit of a no man's land area. But again, emphasis must be taken. I know the D letter sounds bad, and that didn't sound how I wanted it to say, and the E tier letter doesn't sound good, but these are people who, at the top of E tier, I consider firmly okay at the game. Anyway, enough of that, enough of me rambling. Thank you for watching. There'll be more parts to come. Thank you for the feedback, positive and negative. As long as it's constructive, it's all good. And yeah, I will see you guys next time, and have a lovely day.